If you grew up in the 1970s, you already know there was something in the air back then that simply doesn't exist anymore. A raw, unfiltered kind of freedom. A world that moved slower, felt closer, and somehow hit harder in the best possible way. This isn't nostalgia for the sake of it. This is a genuine look back at why that decade shaped a generation unlike any before or since. A world without screens and everything that came with it. Let's start with the most obvious difference between then and now. There were no smartphones, no tablets, no internet, no social media, no streaming, no endless scroll of videos designed to hijack your attention for hours. When you woke up in the morning as a kid in the 1970s, your entertainment wasn't waiting for you on a glowing screen. It had to be invented. It had to be found. It had to be earned. And because of that, it meant something. Kids in the 70s went outside and stayed outside. You left the house after breakfast, and you didn't come back until the streetlights came on. That was the rule in neighborhoods across the country. No GPS, no cell phones, no way for your parents to track you, and somehow, that was completely normal. You rode your bike for miles, you explored empty lots and construction sites. You built forts in the woods. You caught frogs in ditches and threw rocks at telephone poles just to have something to do. You were bored in the most productive way imaginable, because boredom was the engine that drove creativity. There were no participation trophies. There were no scheduled playdates carefully coordinated by parents. You showed up at someone's door, knocked, and asked if they could come out. Sometimes they could, sometimes they couldn't, and you figured it out from there. That kind of social spontaneity taught kids something that modern children are rarely given the chance to learn: how to handle uncertainty, how to be flexible, and how to make something out of nothing. The television was a big deal, and it unified everyone. Television in the 1970s was completely different from what we have today, and not just in picture quality or channel count. There were 3 major networks: ABC, NBC, and CBS, and that was basically it. When something aired on television in the 70s, it was a communal experience. Everyone watched it. Your neighbors watched it. Your classmates watched it. Your grandparents watched it. And the next day, the entire country was talking about the same show, the same commercial, the same news story. Saturday morning cartoons were practically a sacred ritual. Kids would wake up earlier than they'd ever wake up for school, and plant themselves in front of the television with a bowl of cereal to watch shows like Scooby-Doo, Super Friends, The Bugs Bunny Road Runner Show, and Hong Kong Phooey. There was something deeply magical about it, not just because the cartoons themselves were entertaining, but because every other kid in the country was doing the exact same thing at the exact same moment. That shared experience created a cultural bond that modern on-demand streaming simply cannot replicate. Primetime television in the 70s was also doing something genuinely interesting. Shows like All in the Family, MASH, The Mary Tyler Moore Show, Good Times, and The Jeffersons were pushing boundaries, addressing real social issues, and reflecting the turbulence of the times in ways that felt honest and bold. These weren't just entertainment. They were conversations happening at a national level, and growing up with them meant growing up with a certain kind of social awareness, baked right into your childhood. The music was a revolution in progress. To grow up in the 1970s was to grow up during one of the most transformative decades in the history of popular music. The decade began with rock and roll in full dominance. Led Zeppelin, the Rolling Stones, The Who, Aerosmith, and Black Sabbath were defining what hard rock and heavy metal could sound like. At the same time, a completely different world was emerging. Stevie Wonder was releasing some of the most ambitious R&B records ever made. Marvin Gaye was turning soul music into social commentary, and artists like Isaac Hayes, Curtis Mayfield, and Aretha Franklin were cementing a legacy that would influence musicians for generations. Then there was disco. Love it or hate it, disco was an absolutely dominant cultural force in the second half of the decade. Donna Summer, Gloria Gaynor, Chic, The Village People, and of course the Bee Gees. These artists created a sound that took over dance floors, radio stations, and the entire cultural conversation. The disco era was flashy, it was loud, it was unapologetic, and for kids growing up in that environment, it was practically impossible to separate your childhood memories from the driving pulse of a beat coming out of a car radio with the windows rolled down. And then punk arrived. The Sex Pistols, The Clash, The Ramones, Patti Smith, Blondie. Punk was a direct response to everything that felt bloated and overproduced about mainstream rock, and it hit like a freight train. For teenagers in the late 70s, punk wasn't just music, it was an identity, a rebellion, a declaration that the world didn't have to accept what it was handed. The music of the 1970s didn't just accompany childhood and adolescence for that generation. It actively shaped who they became. Toys that required your imagination. The toys of the 1970s were, by modern standards, almost hilariously simple. There were no video game consoles with photorealistic graphics, no toys with built-in screens, no apps to download, no batteries required for most of them. And yet, ask anyone who grew up in that decade what they remember about their toys, and you'll be met with a flood of genuine warmth and enthusiasm. Because the toys of the 70s worked precisely, because they demanded something from the child using them: imagination. Lego sets in the 1970s didn't come with instructions to build one specific thing. You got a bucket of bricks and you figured it out. Star Wars action figures hit the market in 1977 and became an instant obsession. Kids didn't just collect them, they built entire universes with them, constructing elaborate scenes on the living room floor that could stretch for hours. Matchbox cars and Hot Wheels required nothing more than a smooth piece of cardboard to become a full racing circuit. Lite-Brite let you create glowing masterpieces one peg at a time. The easy bake oven actually cooked real food using a light bulb, which in hindsight seems absolutely insane, but felt like genuine magic at the time. Board games were a staple of family life in the 70s in a way they haven't been since. Monopoly, Clue, Life, Stratego, and Risk weren't just rainy day activities. They were the primary form of home entertainment on many evenings. The whole family would gather around the dining room table, and those games could go on for hours. Fights broke out, cheating was suspected, alliances were formed and broken, and at the end of it all, there was a kind of togetherness that no video game has ever quite managed to replicate. School was a different animal. School in the 1970s operated on a completely different philosophy than what most students experience today. The emphasis was less on standardized testing and measurable outcomes, and more on broad exposure to different subjects, independent thinking, and the development of character. Physical education was taken seriously. Kids ran, played, climbed, and competed. Recess was real, extended, and unstructured. Teachers had significantly more authority and significantly more latitude in how they ran their classrooms. The relationship between a teacher and their students in the 70s had a kind of directness, an authenticity that has become increasingly rare. Discipline was more immediate and more physical than what modern parents would accept. Whether or not that was appropriate is a legitimate debate, but what it produced was a particular relationship with authority that was clear and unambiguous. You knew where the lines were, and perhaps more importantly, you knew that adults meant what they said. There was also something profoundly different about how failure was handled in schools of the 70s. If you failed a class, you failed. You repeated the grade. There was no elaborate system of makeup work, no grade inflation designed to make everyone feel equally capable. The expectations were clear, the standards were consistent, and the responsibility for meeting them fell squarely on the student. That could be harsh, but it also created resilience, the understanding that effort and outcome were directly connected, and that the world wasn't going to adjust its standards to accommodate you. The neighborhood was your world. One of the most striking things about growing up in the 1970s, when viewed from the distance of the present, is how intensely local life was. Your neighborhood was your universe. You knew every family on your street. You knew which houses had the best Halloween candy, which neighbors would yell at you for cutting across their yard, which families had kids your age, and which ones were best avoided. You had a mental map of every shortcut, every good climbing tree, every empty lot that doubled as a football field in the fall and a skating rink in the winter. There was a social fabric in 70s neighborhoods that has largely frayed in the decades since. People knew their neighbors not as acquaintances to be politely acknowledged while retrieving the mail, but as genuine parts of daily life. Adults looked out for each other's children. If you got in trouble at the neighbor's house, word got back to your parents before you even made it home. That accountability structure, informal, unspoken, but absolutely real, meant that children grew up inside a web of community relationships that provided both safety and a sense of belonging. Summer in the 1970s was long, genuinely free, and deeply formative. There was no summer enrichment program, no structured activity schedule, no productivity framework imposed on children during the months between school years. You swam at the community pool. You played baseball in the park. You ran through sprinklers. You read comic books on the porch. You stayed up late catching fireflies. You had the extraordinary luxury, though you wouldn't have called it that at the time, of completely unscheduled time, and you filled it the way children instinctively fill free time when left to their own devices, with play, exploration, and the quiet, gradual work of figuring out who you were. The food culture was honest and unpretentious. Eating in the 1970s was uncomplicated in a way that feels almost alien today. Nobody was counting macros. Nobody was on a keto diet or a cleanse. Dinner was dinner, meat, a starch, a vegetable, maybe a salad. Mom cooked it, or sometimes Dad did, and everyone sat down at the same time and ate together. The family dinner table was a daily institution in most households. And what happened around that table? The conversations, the arguments, the jokes, the silences was the texture of family life. Fast food was still a treat in the 70s, not a dietary staple. McDonald's existed, but going there was genuinely special. It was a reward, a celebration, something you look forward to. The golden arches represented a kind of excitement that has long since faded through overexposure. Drive-ins were still a thing. Ice cream trucks still rolled through neighborhoods in the summer, and the sound of that music drifting down the block was enough to make every kid in earshot come running with whatever loose change they could scrape together. School lunches were cooked on premises in most districts. Actual food prepared by actual cooks in actual kitchens, not microwave processed trays. Hot dogs and beans meatloaf macaroni and cheese chicken noodle soup. It wasn't gourmet, but it was food in the truest sense of the word, and it was part of the daily rhythm of school life in a way that felt grounded and real. The cultural shifts that defined the era, the 1970s, were not a simple time. The decade opened with the Vietnam War still grinding on, with Watergate about to shatter the country's trust in its own government, with the civil rights movement still working through the painful gap between legal equality and lived reality. Inflation was brutal. The oil crisis of 1973 changed the way Americans related to energy, consumption, and the limitations of abundance. The women's liberation movement was reshaping expectations in every corner of society. The counterculture of the 60s was still reverberating, but its utopian energy was curdling into something more cynical, more realistic. Growing up in the middle of all that created a generation with a particular kind of toughness and a particular kind of skepticism. Kids who grew up in the 70s heard their parents talk about Watergate at the dinner table, watched the Vietnam War end on the evening news, and came of age during a period when trust in institutions, government, media, religion was being fundamentally questioned. That skepticism wasn't nihilistic. It was earned, and it produced adults who were perhaps better equipped than any generation before or since to function in a complicated, imperfect world without expecting it to be otherwise. The disco era, for all its flash, was also deeply tied to the liberation movements of the time. Gay culture, black culture, and immigrant communities found genuine celebration on the dance floor in ways that mainstream society hadn't yet made room for anywhere else. The music and the nightlife of the late 70s were, in many ways, a declaration of freedom and self-expression that carried real weight and real risk. Growing up adjacent to that, even if you were too young to fully understand it, meant growing up in a world where the meaning of identity was being actively renegotiated in real time. The films that changed what movies could be. The 1970s produced some of the greatest films ever made, and the film culture of the decade was unlike anything that came before or after it. The auteur era was in full swing. Directors like Francis Ford Coppola, Martin Scorsese, Steven Spielberg, George Lucas, and Woody Allen were making films that felt genuinely dangerous and alive. The Godfather, Chinatown, Taxi Driver, Rocky, Annie Hall Network, Apocalypse Now. These weren't just movies, they were events, cultural touchstones that people lined up around the block to see and debated for months afterward. For kids growing up in the 70s, going to the movies was a genuine occasion. You dressed up a little, you got there early, you waited in line. The theater was enormous, the screen was massive, and the experience was fully immersive in a way that watching a film on a laptop simply cannot approximate. And then 1977 happened, and Star Wars changed everything. For children who saw it in the summer of its release, the impact was seismic, a film so overwhelming in its ambition, its execution, that it felt less like watching a movie and more like being transported to another universe entirely. For an entire generation, that moment divided time into before and after. What that generation carried forward. People who grew up in the 1970s carry something with them that is genuinely difficult to quantify, but immediately recognizable when you encounter it. A certain self-sufficiency, a capacity for boredom without panic, an ability to navigate social situations without a device in their hand, a tolerance for discomfort, for ambiguity, for the messy, unresolved texture of real life. These weren't lessons taught in classrooms or programmed into scheduled activities. They were absorbed through lived experience, through thousands of unstructured hours, through scraped knees and failed experiments and long summer days that had no agenda. The 1970s were not a perfect decade. They were in many ways a hard, complicated, turbulent time. The nostalgia for them is not nostalgia for perfection. It's nostalgia for something more specific and more valuable, the experience of a childhood that trusted children to be capable, that gave them space to fail and freedom to explore, that embedded them in communities and families, and neighborhoods where human connection was the default, not the exception. Every kid who ran barefoot across a lawn in July, who traded baseball cards in a school hallway, who sat in a dark theater and watched a galaxy far, far away explode to life for the first time. They were living something that cannot be manufactured or replicated or scheduled. That is what made growing up in the 1970s so unforgettable. Not the toys or the music or the Saturday morning cartoons, though those things matter too. It was the fundamental quality of the life being lived, direct, embodied, free, and fully, irreversibly real.